Wiradjuri Nura Yigu Marala Burugu Yi Wallamadigu Barrow. Good evening, everybody. My name's Leanne Holt. I'm a Warramai Biripi woman from mainly the Karua area, the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor Indigenous Strategy at Macquarie University, and really pleased to be able to welcome you here tonight. So we have the opportunity here to at our Q&A session to actually be able to listen and learn and be able to place ourselves in a position that we can make good choices. We are facing a key milestone within Aboriginal, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and it's such an important time for us to be able to come to things like tonight and be able to ask questions and have conversations that are respectful and reciprocal. And so in a few months' time, all Australians will need to vote yes or no in the referendum to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution by giving them an advisory voice in their own affairs. Voting yes or no is an important decision, and it is important that we get fully informed, like I said. That is why we're holding the information session tonight, so that you can hear from some of Australia's leading experts and ask them your questions. This event is being live streamed, and we also welcome the people that we have joining us online tonight as well. Tonight we want to have respectful and open discussion. I'm a passionate supporter of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples having a constitutionally guaranteed voice in decisions made about our own communities. I support this because I think Indigenous peoples deserve to be recognised in the Constitution. And both within my studies and professionally and personally, I've seen firsthand how getting Indigenous advice on Indigenous policy improves policies and practical outcomes. There are a range of views, so this is about having that open and respectful discussion, and I encourage you all to participate respectfully. Tonight we are privileged to be joined by Noel Pearson, who will be our headline speaker. Noel will provide some opening remarks, and then he will be joined by our panel members, Gary Field and Dr. Shireen Morris. And we will then open it up for discussions and questions. Many of you have already submitted questions, and thank you for that. There's some very interesting and diverse questions that we've received, and we look forward to having the discussion about that. After the discussion concludes, I hope you will join us for some drinks and nibblies in the foyer and some great discussion. Our headline speaker tonight, as I said, is Noel Pearson. Noel comes from the Gugu Yimara community of Hopevale on southeastern Cape York Peninsula. Noel has provided a sustained driving force in the discourse on Indigenous rights in our country for over 30 years. I'd say it'd be well over 30 years, actually. Oh, I wasn't saying that you were old or anything. That wasn't a reflection on your age, just on your wisdom. Noel is the co-founder of the Cape York Land Council and negotiated with the Keating government to establish the Native Title Act 1993 after the Mabo High Court decision finally rejected the fiction of terra nullius. Noel has also pioneered empowering and holistic approaches to welfare reform and transforming educational outcomes for disadvantaged students. He is the founder of Cape York Partnership and Good to Great Schools Australia, and has co-founded other organisations also dedicated to ameliorating entrenched disadvantage of the bottom million. As well as seeking behaviour change in families and communities, Noel has long advocated for structural reforms to empower Indigenous peoples. He served as a member of the expert panel on constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians and the Referendum Council. Noel is currently a member of the First Nations Referendum Working Group and continues to advocate for structural reforms that empower Indigenous peoples. Welcome, Noel.
Thank you very much, Leanne, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Macquarie University, for this opportunity to talk with you about the voice. I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I bring greetings from Cape York Peninsula. We're on the last straight of a long journey. We've been working towards this for 15 years. No other public policy issue has taken as long as the voice. No other public policy issue in this country has involved as many parliamentary committees and public consultation processes as the voice. It has been a very hard road. We've gone through 5 governments and 6 prime ministers. But we're on the last stretch. There have been a lot of doubters from the very beginning. The first doubt was you'd never get a Conservative Prime Minister to kick the ball off. We did. John Howard kicked this ball off on the eve of the federal election in 2007. That was crucial. Nixon had to go to China on constitutional recognition. And we worked for that to happen, and it did happen. Of course, the Prime Minister may have resiled from his commitment to constitutional recognition, but the historical record is plain. He said the time was right. The country was ready. The country wanted a national settlement of this issue. You read his 2007 speech, there could not be a more complete argument as to why the country needed to go and settle this issue through constitutional recognition. Of course, his idea was to run a second go at putting a preamble in the Constitution. Preambular recognition. I said to him, that is not going to be sufficient, Prime Minister. There won't be support for that. Recognition has to be substantive. I said it an hour before he gave his speech. And he said, oh, we can take up the discussion after the election. Of course, he was no more to be, and the democracy moved on. My argument in relation to his changed position, or at least, is that we've gone through a democratic process for 15 years. We didn't land where he wanted it to land, but democracy can't be the prerogative of one person. He wanted preambular recognition. That is not what has emerged. What has emerged is a voice to Parliament. You go through parliamentary processes, you have national consultations, you have 5 governments run the issue for a very long time, and you end up with a different preference to that of the former Prime Minister. But if you respect the Westminster process and the processes of our parliamentary democracy, surely you adjust your position according to the outcomes of that process. That's my argument. Okay, 2011, the Gillard government sets up the expert panel, and a series of processes happen, and ideas swing, a host of ideas emerge for constitutional recognition, how to give effect to recognition. But the one that emerges with consensus from Indigenous people is the one that emerged in 2017 for a voice. We canvassed a whole range of possibilities for how the Constitution might recognise our people. And almost an entire consensus settled on the idea of a voice. There were dissenters at Uluru, but they were a very small proportion of the people met there. What people wanted was an ability to have a say about the laws and policies affecting our people. Now, the second thing that doubters had to say was, oh, but you'll never get it through the Parliament. Sorry, that's the third thing. The second thing was, you'll never get consensus. Well, we got consensus at Uluru. It was probably the high watermark of self-determination was Uluru. How does a people pull together a consensus like that nationally? The process was meticulous and assiduously prosecuted by leaders from all across the country. The third thing was, you'll never get it through the Parliament, the naysayers said. Well, it's gone through the Parliament. So the last doubt now is whether the Australian people will vote yes. And I'm telling you they will. We will win this referendum, because it's time for the country to press the switch to yes. Indigenous people can't languish in an Australia that has the default setting of no. You want to understand why the position of our people is so parlous in their own country? Worse than any other jurisdiction around the world? It's because the country has determined that the power button should remain off. What do I mean when I say the country is set on position no? Well, with the arrival of the colonists, they knew there were people here. The absolute question had to be, what do we do with them? How are they to be accommodated in this new colony? Shouldn't we determine something about this and make provision for it? Answer no. And many bad things flowed from that no. And then in 1901, the colonies decide to come together under a national constitution. The Indigenes are still here, albeit in a parlous position, much reduced in numbers, much misery. And the question at the time of federation, was there going to be recognition and inclusion? Default answer, no. In fact, an explicit exclusion. The new constitution of the Commonwealth mentions Aborigines twice, both in the negative. Firstly, the new federal parliament is prevented from legislating in relation to Aboriginal people. Secondly, we're not counted in the census. We remedied those two problems in 1967, but then there's no Aborigines mentioned in the Constitution since then. We now have a Constitution cleared of the word Aboriginal. So 67 remedied an exclusion, but it didn't effect a recognition. Let me tell you one clear thing about the 67 referendum. It was focused on section 5126, the so-called race power. The federal parliament having the power to make laws in relation to the people's, special laws in relation to people of any race. Now, that clause was originally put in the Constitution to control the Chinese and Asians. It wasn't an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander power. They had no... The Indigenous people were specifically excluded from it. We had a racist power in the Constitution to control the Chinese. It was like we had this little cage in the Constitution to limit, to control the immigration and limit the abilities of Chinese people in the country. But of course, as we got rid of the Australia policy in the 60s with Holt and later with Whitlam, the need for a Chinese and Asian cage disappeared. And who did we put in the old cage? Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So our parliament to this day has a special power to make special laws in respect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It is a power that applies to no one else. Every other law the Parliament generates applies to all of us, except laws under 5126. And it is a power based on the idea of race. So the proposal for a First Nations voice was based on the idea that when you make special laws in relation to these people, shouldn't they not have a say in relation to that, to the Parliament? So we've got an argument that we need to have a say in relation to these specific laws that are made about us. And Parliament should be able to hear from us our views. We also want the executive government to hear our views on matters of policy and programs and government. We now have a provision, and this provision has been developed with a clear eye to constitutional safety. Two former Chief Justices of the High Court helped us settle the drafting. And the Solicitor General amended the drafting before it was put to the House and passed. We now have a safe set of words that Australians can adopt at the referendum. I want to concentrate. I've been around the countryside talking to people, Tasmania, I've been up in Newcastle, I've been around Brisbane, Ipswich and other places in Queensland. I've been with the Liberals up in the North Shore. And I'm finding that the most important thing we can do as citizens is concentrate on the words. Because this is what we're being asked to vote yes or no to. It's the alteration. And concentrating on the words, I realised literally in Newcastle the other week, that this is important pedagogy for this referendum. this is important for everyone to understand. I think the starting place and the ending place is this provision. We've got to all reflect on this. We've got to all get our heads around it. And thank God it's plain English. You don't need to be a constitutional lawyer to understand. What you think it means is basically what it means. And I want to take you through it. So, there'll be a new Chapter 9 that says recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And there'll be a new Section 129 saying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. And it reads, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers, and procedures. Okay. I think there's 4 important parts to the proposed alteration. And the first part concerns recognition. And the words of recognition are very simple. They say, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. That's how this amendment will recognise Indigenous people. It'll recognise them as the first peoples of Australia. That's about as simple as it gets. I think the country can come at that. I think the country knows the truth of that. And I think the country can see the profundity of it. It's heavy-duty words, even though they're so simple. It's heavy-duty because it's sitting in the Constitution. Everything gets heavy-duty in the Constitution. Which is why these words are so important. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. And when we vote for that, we will vote for something that we never did in 250 years. Because the act of putting this in the Constitution is an act we've never done before. Nothing as weighty as this have we ever done. And those words are plain. The second part is the guarantee. It's like after 2.5 centuries, some kind of guarantee's got to be given to the Indigenous people. Some kind of promise that's going to be long-lasting and long-kept. What is it? The guarantee is that there shall be a body. And this is a guarantee given by the Australian people to Indigenous people. It's not a guarantee from the Parliament or from the government. It's a guarantee from the Australian people via a vote in this referendum. Australians guarantee to Indigenous Australians that there shall be a body. The third aspect of the drafting, or the clause that we're being asked to approve at the referendum, is the purpose. What is the purpose of this body? Well, the words again are plainly there for us to read and understand. The purpose is that the voice may make representations. That's what its purpose is, to make representations to the Parliament and the executive government on what? On matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Not submarines, parking tickets, emergencies in Martin Place when some shooter is in the cafe there, and Peter Credlin says, in the future, the police will have to ring the voice. No, it's on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Read the plain words. They mean what you think it means. Professor Anne Toomey took me back a bit, Shireen, at the town hall last week when she explained what make representations is. She said that is what everybody does when they make representations to Parliament. The thing here is that these representations will be made on behalf of the people that are affected by Section 5126. People who are subject to the special law making function of the Federal Parliament, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They'll speak on behalf of the peoples who were the first peoples of the country. But how they will speak to the Parliament is in exactly the same way as everybody else, which is they can make representations. And those representations are not directive. The people hearing the representation are not obliged to follow it. Of course, we hope that the voice will be very influential. But it will be influential if it provides smart advice. The fourth function is the detail. And this kind of popped out at me only recently as well. The answer to the question of detail is in the last clause. The Parliament shall have power to make laws. That's where the detail is. When the Parliament exercise the power to make laws, they generate the detail. And they generate the detail in relation to composition, functions, powers and procedures. All of the questions you've got. How will the representation, what will the voice do? What powers will it have? What procedures will it be subject to? The Parliament supplies all that detail because the Australian people, as with other provisions in the Constitution, is giving the Parliament the responsibility to do that. The other crucial thing to recognise about that clause is it doesn't say government. Our system, actually, the lawmaking system, involves Parliament making the laws. Anthony Albanese may propose a model and put up a bill after the referendum, but it has to go through the Senate that he doesn't control. It's Parliament that makes the law at the end of the day and furnishes the detail. It's Parliament that's got to get it right. And if they don't get it right, they've got the complete power to amend it. Always have a power to chop and change the legislation. That's Parliament's function. I give the example of the Australian Broadcasting Commission. It's under, the ABC is legislated under a power in the Constitution. And that constitutional power meant that the federal Parliament in 1932 generated the detail in a bill and passed through the House as an act. So all of the details about the ABC were legislated by the federal Parliament in 1932, amended in 1942 quite substantially and critically, and then a new act. The old one was scrapped and a new act was put in 1983. That's normal use of constitutional power by a parliament. The Constitution always gave our federal parliament the power to legislate something like the ABC, and we've had kind of 2.5 versions of it ever since the ABC was created. I don't know, we might go another 20 years and have a new ABC Act. That's up to the Parliament. And same with the voice. We might have a model, a first model next year when we pass the referendum, first version, and that might go for 15 years, 25 years, and then everybody might decide, oh, we need to remodel this thing. And it'll be up to the Parliament to decide. That's our system. But who are the people who've been saying, where's the detail? Where's the detail? Who's hiding the detail? Who've been the ones going around the countryside saying, who's hiding the detail? Where is the detail? It's been the parliamentarians, the very people responsible for generating the detail. And yet they say, not my responsibility. That has been the great lie of this debate. The great lie has been that the very people responsible for the detail have been saying, where's the detail? The fact is that the detail comes after the referendum. This referendum is about the power, giving the Parliament the power to do this. And the power is, in the first clause, the Parliament shall have power. So, I think this clause will complete the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't recognise Indigenous people. Australia is incomplete as long as our Constitution is incomplete. And a yes vote will close that exclusion and put no behind us. We will enter a yes world where the Indigenous people of Australia are part of yes rather than no. And it'll be a profound change. That Saturday night, after the referendum, the country will undergo a profound change. Sunday will be a new chapter. Because we will have dealt with something that had been not dealt with for 250 years, 235 years. Depends if you call the First Fleet or Captain Cook. And this will be a good thing for the whole country. This is an opportunity for the whole country. I think we're going to bequeath our children and great-grandchildren a real boon. They're going to grow up in an Australia where they really understand where they fit, who they are. Black fellas, white fellas, migrants. We're all going to know we're Australian and how we fit in. I think for us to default to no, we'll miss a big opportunity to get something right that we've never got right. And I could put this argument to you with incredulity, and that wouldn't be pretty. I could put this argument to you with vehemence, and that would not be nice. And I could put this argument to you with kind of, really? This is too hard? We can't do this? But I'm going to put it to you, beseeching you as Australians, that we have a chance to get this right. I know it's critically important for my people and our future generations. I just beseech you because it's going to be important for your kids too, that we get this right. And if that is correct, then we have to put every energy to the wheel. Every train station, every street, every community hall, every letterbox, every door, we've got to be knocking. And the 97% have got to take as much responsibility for this outcome as the 3%. Guess whose vote counts more? You can't just sit back and say, oh, that'd be a nice thing to do, but, you know, I hope the blackfellas get there. Well, only 3%. We need you guys to mobilise. If this is important to you and your children, we need you to mobilise. And this is a winning proposition, I tell you. Once our people, if you take them through this analysis of, because everything else is just, you can have all kinds of arguments. You can conjure all kinds of fears. You can conjure all kinds of, damnation scenarios. But when you focus on the words, those are the words that we will adopt into the Constitution. And they make sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those informative and inspiring words. Okay, I'm privileged to be able to introduce our other two panellists here tonight. And our first one is Gary Field, who is a proud Wiradjuri man who's grown up on Darkinjung country on the Central Coast his entire life. Gary has a Bachelor of Social Science, a postgrad in Indigenous Trauma Recovery and Practice from the University of Wollongong, where he is also in his final year of a Master of Indigenous Health. He is currently the Operations Manager at Barang Regional Alliance, where he has been involved in supporting the objectives of the Alliance and its opt-in members. Our second panellist, Dr. Shireen Morris, is a constitutional lawyer and a director of the Radical Centre Reform Lab at Macquarie University Law School. She has worked for the last 12 years with Noel and Cape York Institute, devising and advocating the concept of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous voice. Over the last 2 years, the Reform Lab has been particularly working to build support among multi-faith and multicultural communities. Thank you very much, the panellists. I'm going to come over here and sit with our panellists, and we're going to start a bit of conversation. So, Gary, we're going to start with you. And so you've now listened to Noel's remarks, and so we're interested to see, what does the upcoming referendum mean for you, and why is it important?
Look, I think it's probably worthwhile talking about the relationship between hope and responsibility and what we see for future generations, whether that be, as Noel so eloquently put, you know, for blackfellas, for whitefellas, or for anybody else for that matter that comes to this great nation. And the reason I say that is because I was actually a part of a group of then 15 and 16-year-olds who reenacted the 1963 freedom rides, of which Charles Perkins and a group of university students led across New South Wales. And we went around all of those communities on a 2-week, quite uncomfortable bus ride, if I'm going to be honest, where we took the messages of community around the things that were important. And it was a culmination of things that led to us handing to then, it was Gillard and the expert panel on what the constitutional recognition debate could look like. That was, in essence, my first opportunity to really see what it meant for people on the ground to feel voiceless, but at the same time to feel like they could have an opportunity to lead change in this country. And so back to the question around hope, my hope is that we can be, as a nation, a mature nation, ready to grapple this and to lead with what is quite a simple proposition, a generous and a reconciling proposition for future generations, so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know that they are welcome and that there is, in fact, a permanent position for us, not only in the nation's birth certificate, but in society more generally. And I live in hope that I and my children, and hopefully one day my grandchildren, know that they're wanted, that they're cared about, and that this is a place that shares those positions.
Thanks, Gary. And you're right, the Freedom Ride was such a key part of our history. And I just was at Newcastle when you did the last leg, coming home from that reenactment. And we see now that there's been a website established for the virtual Freedom Ride that is campaigning for the Yes campaign that is being supported by most of the universities around Australia. Shireen, so 12 years. Been working with the Cape York Institute, starting as a law intern, and then continuing your work, and now here at Macquarie. What does this referendum boil down to for you?
Yeah, it's it's so inspiring. First of all, listening to Noel articulate his case for this, and then Gary, you as well. And for me, I mean, I went up to Cape York and met Noel. You know, I hadn't quite finished my law degree at Monash. And the first thing I learnt from Noel and other Indigenous leaders around the place was the history. As Noel said, the fact that Indigenous people weren't included in those discussions that gave rise to the constitution that created Australia, you know. And I always think about it in terms of power. Like, the Constitution is our highest legal rule book, but it's the document that distributes legal and political power in this country, and it sets out rules and principles that dictate the way Australia is governed and dictate the way power is shared out in our country. And as the Uluru Statement says, you know, it talks about the torment of powerlessness that Indigenous communities experience. For me, as I learned, that powerlessness goes right back to the Constitution. Because as Noel said, the Constitution established this really top-down power relationship with Indigenous people. Noel always used to talk about the elephant and the mouse, you know. There's this 3% mouse that has to deal with this massive, powerful 97% elephant. And the Constitution presides over that unfair power relationship. And because of that power relationship under the Constitution, There have been decades and decades of discriminatory and unfair laws and policies made by the elephant about the squeaking mouse. Laws denying them the vote in some jurisdictions right up until the 60s, and actually formal equality across the board in voting rights wasn't achieved till something like 1983. Policies banning their languages from being spoken sometimes. Policies denying them equal wages for their hard work, sometimes non-existent wages. Policies splitting families apart, removing children, of course denying their property rights. And even though most of those really bad policies are in the past, even today, that top-down power dynamic is still in play. So governments in far-off Canberra make laws and policies with good intentions, trying to close the gap, spending a lot of money. But I don't know if you read the news this week about that Productivity Commission report, and it said what Indigenous communities have been telling us this whole time. It said Australia is failing miserably to close the gap. Why? Because bureaucrats don't know how to listen, don't know how to work with Indigenous communities. So despite the goodwill and despite the money spent, we are failing, and the gap is getting wider on some indicators. And that report tells us that we need structural reform to compel policymakers, compel the politicians in Canberra to partner with Indigenous communities when making laws and policies about them. So that's what this boils down to for me. It's a yes or no question. Are we going to say yes, Indigenous people deserve to be recognised in the Constitution from which they were excluded in 1901 through having a guaranteed advisory voice when government and parliament makes laws and policies about them? Just advisory, not a veto? Or are we going to say no? No, we want things to stay the same. No for the status quo. That's the decision. And I'm just blown away by the modesty of this request, the drafting that Noel took us through, that emanated from the Uluru Statement from Indigenous people. Because even though they've gone through all that exclusion, all that violence, there was violence, all that discrimination, even despite all that, they're coming to us and saying, actually, we would like to be in, please. We would like to be in your constitution permanently. We would like to be recognised. And all we ask for is an advisory voice. That's all. It's an incredibly generous, very modest request. So yes or no? Is it going to be yes to recognition and listening, commitment to listening and dialogue? Or no, we want things to stay the same?
Thanks, Shireen. And we got to this request because we continue to have the worst health outcomes, the worst educational outcomes, the highest incarceration rates of any population in Australia. So obviously what's happening now is not working. So, we're seeking a better solution at the end of the day, and I think that's what it comes down to. So we have some questions from the floor. We have some questions that have been sent in earlier before we started. And so the first is, did the government communicate with the elders of the Indigenous community to assess if this could be actually beneficial? And anyone want to? Noel, did you want to answer that?
I'm happy to jump in first. Look, each community differs, and I think that I'm standing here today, as you introduced, as a Wiradjuri man. I'm coming to you, Wallumbaiwa, from Darkinjung country, where I have been privileged to be nurtured and raised in a community that has supported me to not only talk about this work, but to stand here today to also, we'll sit here actually, but to talk about the matters in front of us. Now, when you ask the question around were all of the Indigenous elders across all of the communities involved in this process, I don't know is the answer, but what I do know is that, as Noel and Shireen have spoken about, for those that did head to Uluru and were a part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the drafting of those generous words, they were supported by their communities to represent their communities in that space. Now, from Darkinjung country, we, as a community, made a decision about who we would send. And they had the permission from our community to talk about the things that were important to us. So that's where it leads from. And at the end of the day, for fear of, I guess, asking somebody to put the shoe on the other foot, I am yet to find a space in which everybody agrees on everything. And in fact, I would find it quite unhealthy if everybody agreed on everything. Debates are normal. Confusion in this space becomes normal as a result of people suggesting that everybody should think, feel, and act the same. So yeah, I guess that would be where I would leave it. I think that yes, community supported their elders to participate in this process. It was the longest consultation process, the most involved consultation process in the history of this country when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's really important, and we supported it.
Did you want to add something, Noel? I just want to add that there's this long history of Indigenous leaders, elders, calling for a voice. William Cooper in 1937 petitioned the King asking for a voice in Parliament. 1963, Yolngu Bark petitions asked for fairer consultation when government makes decisions about them. 1988, Barunga Statement, they gave a statement to Bob Hawke at that time saying we want a treaty and asking for an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander body to oversee Aboriginal affairs. ATSIC was subsequently created, but only in legislation, so it didn't have the constitutional guarantee that Noel has explained, and so when problems arose, it got chucked out, right? The Uluru Statement was the culmination of all of that history, and it was the first ever national Indigenous consensus. And as you just said, there were 250 Indigenous delegates at the final Uluru Convention, chosen by their Indigenous peers all around the country. Of that 250, 7 dissented. And the now Senator Lydia Thorpe was among those 7 dissenters, right? Now, 250 minus 7 is something like a 97% consensus. That is extraordinary, an extraordinary majority when you think about, especially when you think about the diversity of Indigenous Australia, linguistic, cultural differences, north-south differences, urban, regional, remote differences, personality, political differences, yet 97%. And since then, polls consistently show that over 80%, well over 80% of Indigenous Australians want a guaranteed voice in their affairs. Now, I'm Indian, Fijian Indian background. You would never get that level of consensus on anything in the Indian community, let alone on something as complicated as constitutional reform, right? So I completely agree with you that it would just be weird if there was 100% consensus. But we as non-Indigenous people, I mean, what more do they actually humanly need to do before we will believe that, yes, the majority of Indigenous people want this? We should respect that, I think, and do the work. They've done so much hard work to get to this point. We've got to now return that favour and do the hard work to get this over the line.
Thanks, Shireen, and thanks, Gary. What happens if so we're assuming that we have a yes vote go through. What happens then if the government goes against the advice of the voice?
Noel, you want to take this one?
The normal democratic process. You know, when government doesn't listen to your representations, what do? You go back, you try another angle, you try to get alliances with other people, just the normal stuff. The important thing is to make clever representations and be very strategic about the way you approach the government, which has limited attention, limited ability to understand complex things at any one time. Yeah? You've got to take all of that into account. If you want to be effective, you're not going to get all of your solutions done in the first 2 years. We've got to be part of the democratic process in Canberra, being very strategic about building the policy case for an argument. We've got a lot of work cut out for us. Health, education, jobs, training, young people in jail, justice, housing, economic development, the future of remote communities, all of the full range of issues affecting our people are going to be before us, and we have to be strategic about how we tackle them. And we're also got to respect diversity of, Cape York might want to do things differently from the Kimberley. Got to be able to present a position to Canberra to say the people in Cape York want to deal with this problem like this, but the mob in the Kimberley want to deal with it slightly differently. It's not beyond us to make representations to Canberra to take into account the diversity of views from different parts of the country. And sometimes government might have to make choices. They say, oh, well, I'm hearing this from there and we're hearing this from there, and we as a government are going to make a decision about this. So that is how we will deal with governments that may not listen to us in the first place. But I tell you what won't happen. What won't happen in the future. I've been thinking about this issue of rheumatic heart disease, which our kids in Cape York suffer in great numbers from. Rheumatic heart disease is almost a mild fever, and then your heart is compromised for the rest of your life. There was a leader in North Queensland who at the age of 46, leading his community, drops dead last week. And until I hear otherwise, I'm going to suspect rheumatic heart disease. That's what happens. In the middle of a football game, you have a cardiac arrest. Because of the great prevalence of rheumatic heart fever amongst young kids. Eradicated through many nations across the world, including Australia, other than in respect of Aboriginal kids. It's a big problem. We have had a Member of Parliament represent those communities that have rheumatic heart disease in tragic proportions. We've had that member represent us in Canberra for 26 years, and he's never said one word about rheumatic heart disease. That's why we need a voice. What won't happen in the future is people falling silent on a big problem. It's got to be brought to the attention. It's got to be brought to the attention. It's got to be brought to the attention of the government and the Parliament until we get action on this. Because we can eradicate it. If we put a full court press on the things that contribute to rheumatic heart disease, we can eradicate it because other people have. Other nations have. But we'll never eradicate it if there's nobody putting a voice to it. And that is why, how can you represent Indigenous people in your seat and not say anything about it when you've been in power for 3 decades almost? Parliamentary representation only takes you so far. He's got his other issues, yeah? He's got his other priorities, other concerns to represent. He just doesn't think that the diseases that his constituents are having early death visiting them is important enough. So I think that is what is going to stop happening with The Voice. The Voice is going to put these issues front and centre so that they're addressed.
Thank you. We've already touched on this a little bit, but why do some Indigenous peoples oppose this proposal?
I mean, we spoke about it, right? Like, to think that everybody in any group is completely homogenous and shares and thinks and feels and acts the same way would absolutely be ludicrous and unhealthy. And maybe if I could just quickly go back to the previous question around what would happen if the Parliament, for example, didn't take the advice of the voice. Let's again put the shoe on the other foot here and go, well, how would you feel if the majority of Australians have voted yes and support the fact that this is the appropriate vehicle to drive change for Indigenous communities across this nation, and your voted parliamentarians and your constituency isn't getting represented appropriately? Flip the switch, as Noel has said, from no's to yeses, and we'll see real outcomes. Now to the other point around not everybody agrees. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Sometimes I prefer to shop at Woolies. Sometimes people prefer to shop at Coles. And I think that that's completely okay. But to stop somebody from making that decision would be, removing a fundamental right. And that's what this is about. It's about ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, with consensus, have come to an agreement around how we want to drive this, and that is through a voice. Shireen's spoken about the fact that some of this work's been happening since the late 1800s. Multiple statements and bark petitions are now in the halls of Parliament, where they're collecting dust and spectators come in and take photos and walk away and go, oh, wasn't that a beautiful piece of art? We're not doing that anymore. We're at a point where we, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, are pulling a chair up to the table and saying, this is how we need to do it. And it needs the constitutional hook and the permanent position in the Constitution so that at the whim of government and at the stroke of a pen, we don't continue to have to start from ground zero, or the old Groundhog Day. Wake up, start again, try again. This is a real opportunity, and I think that I would reject the claim that that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't agree that we should have a say on matters that impact us. Yes, there is a difference of opinion around how that may look, but we want a say on our own affairs, and I think that there's enough history and literature and evidence to suggest that if we're listened to, we know the solutions, our communities know the solutions, and that's how you'll get change in this country.
Thanks, Gary. And I agree. And I when I hear some of those differing of opinions, and what I do agree is that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want what's best for Aboriginal and for the future of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And a lot of the conversation in the community with opposing views is around freedom and sovereignty. However, as Noel said, 97% of the voters are going to be not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and my concern is that they're not going to be voting no because of freedom and sovereignty. So I think that I think that it's important to recognise the diversity of our communities and that we are allowed to have differing opinions, but at the end of the day, what's best for our communities is what our community wants. So leading on from that, I suppose, is that the next question is, what do you make of the suggestion that this will undermine First Nations sovereignty? Shireen, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's so the first thing I think to understand is that the word sovereignty is a really complex word that takes on many different meanings depending on who's saying it and the context they're saying it in. Remember during the pandemic, there were people who called themselves sovereign citizens and they ran around not wearing masks, So there's that kind of sovereignty. And then the Uluru Statement talks about this ancient spiritual sovereignty that is the connection First Nations have with this continent. But it always speaks to notions of power, coming back to what the Constitution is about. Well, battles for sovereignty, historically and around the world, they're battles for power and control and authority. And, you look at how those sovereignty battles play out worldwide. Well, they often play out through bloodshed and military action and, violence. So I think it's important to understand that sovereignty is largely a political question, right? It's not really, in practical reality, it's not really a question of legal and moral right. It's a question of might. Who wins the battle? And so the way I imagine it when I read the Uluru Statement is that, you know, there was this ancient First Nations sovereignty extending back thousands and thousands of years that still survives, but along came the British with their competitive sovereignty, you know, and there was the battle for sovereignty, and the British colonisers had more power. And the Australian Constitution was implanted over the top of this ancient First Nations sovereignty, which nonetheless survives, but it's being squashed down by these imposed structures, right? Colonial and now Australian sovereignty. And when I read the Uluru Statement, it says, you know, through these constitutional reforms, our ancient spiritual sovereignty will shine through as a fuller expression of our nationhood. Now think about that. So when I hear those words, I think, you know, this is a way of making space in Australia's constitutional arrangements for that ancient First Nations sovereignty to shine through and express itself through this voice, express itself in a real and practical way through this voice, but in a way that is completely respectful of the coexisting sovereignty of Australian governments and parliaments. And the Uluru Statement uses that word, coexist. So while the Lydia Thorpes on the far left, they're interested in separatism, as sort of a separatist conception of sovereignty, I think the vast majority, pragmatic majority of Indigenous Australians, they want inclusion, unity, partnership, togetherness. So this is a consolidation. This would be bringing that ancient sovereignty into the nation in a way that coexists peacefully, brings together the sovereignty of Australian parliaments and governments. So I see it as a consolidation, a unity. And that's why people say, oh, the Uluru Statement is a peace offering, because it's like, nah, no more of those battles for sovereignty. Let's bring these stories together. Let's bring the ancient with the British and the multicultural, as Noel would say.
Thanks, Shireen. So you sort of touched on power dynamics there. And so Veronica, one of our watchers, has asked, what should I tell people who are concerned that giving Indigenous communities a voice will take rights away from other Australians? Noel's onto this one.
That's always been the case. That's always been the reason to say no. If we recognised the land rights of the Indigenous people back in 1788 or at any time during the 19th century, what standing did we have? Recognising Aboriginal land rights was like an existential question for colonists. If you recognised it, you're kind of delegitimating yourself. There's a great judge, a great lawyer, Richard Windayer, who fought against the recognition of land rights in New South Wales. And he made that argument. He said, you know, if we recognise Aboriginal rights to land, well, what place do we have in this country? We have to say no. And of course, when we had the Mabo decision, we're going to lose our backyards. People are going to lose their land. Not 1 square metre was lost after Mabo and the Native Title Act. And yet, I don't know, older members of the audience remember how vehement those debates were in the 1990s. People are going to use backyards and so on. It never happened. Not 1 square metre was lost by anybody. And we get this same concern now. People are going to lose things. People are going to lose land. People are going to lose rights. But but it's never true. It's never been true, those scare campaigns. And so I'm hopeful that we're at a point of our history now when we can see a scare campaign plainly. And that we know all of these lurid kind of imaginings are just part of a campaign to defeat the recognition. And we've got to rise above it. We have to rise, our campaign has to rise above it. I really, I don't look down the manhole of social media. I know that little metal circle in the street there. I know what's under there. Why the hell would you want to look under? You go down there, the smell is bad, and all these blue lights in the dark, and the crevices of social media shouldn't be part of our campaign. It's there, but walk the street, walk the hills, walk the beach. Don't get down into the sewer with them. The orcs and the trolls, that's where they live. We can win this without them. We have got to appeal to a real human heart. We're never going to win this against the bots. We have got to run this campaign over the next 2.5 months from the heart and to the heart. I really urge the Yes campaign to stay out of that stuff. Don't expend bad energy on the trolls. Rather, get down to the railway station and have a brief conversation. Knock on the doors. Talk conversations with your fellow Australians about this. Let's lift this debate up. Look to the sunny uplands. Look to the sunny uplands, because that's where our hope lies. And I just think, down in the crevices under the manhole, that's where all these scare campaigns are, and quite frankly, they're beneath us. Those campaigns and those messages are beneath us. It's something that I think, if we have faith in our fellow Australians, we're going to get there. I have a complete belief in that.
Can I just add? If someone asks you that, the answer is no. It doesn't take a single thing away from anybody else. Not a single thing. This is an advisory voice. Parliament and government already make Indigenous specific laws and policies. Like Noel said, Parliament already has a special constitutional power that it only uses to make laws about Indigenous people, like the Native Title Act, closing the gap policies and all sorts of other things. All this is saying is that when government and Parliament make those laws and policies, Indigenous communities should have a fair say, so that hopefully the policies are more effective and hopefully we'll start to slowly close the gap. Non-Indigenous people actually gain from that, because if we start to close the gap, we'll stop wasting so much money on ineffective policy. And because as long as Indigenous people are left behind in this country, we're all losing out at the end of the day, because it's bad for the country. If there's a sector of our society locked out of prosperity and opportunity, that's bad for everybody, right? So this doesn't take a single thing away from non-Indigenous people. We all gain if this goes through.
Okay, so just hold that thought. I'm just going to ask one more question that was a pre-question, and then I'm going to ask for 3 questions from the floor because we're running out of time. But this is one of my favourite ones. So what is the best response to the argument that Indigenous people should be treated the same as all Australians? Will this divide us by race? And I like this one because it assumes that we haven't already been divided by race for how many hundreds of years. So, Gary, do you want to respond to that?
Oh, look, I think the first thing, and back to, again, Noel's point around the crevices, to use your words, of social media, is similarly to the COVID situation. We had this uprising of epidemiologists who all of a sudden knew everything there was to know about public health, and now we've got the voice debate, and all of a sudden we've got constitutional lawyers in every single household, which is nonsense. So I think the point to be made there is that, you know, there are experts. I'm sitting beside two of them, in between. You know, they've shared information, they've pointed in the right direction. They've said, no, this will not divide, this will unite. This is a reconciling moment for this great country. And so that's got to be the response. No, this is not going to cause division. No, this isn't about making sure that one race has superiority over the other. This is about inclusivity, this is about reconciliation, this is about connection and unity, and that's the response.
You know, Peter Dutton's argument that this will re-racialise the Constitution, or that this puts race back into the Constitution, I just want to be clear, is utterly incorrect. It's a lie. Okay, because as we've explained, race has been in there since 1901. We've been divided by race under the Constitution since 1901, and Indigenous people have been treated very unfairly because they were believed to be an inferior race. And there are racially discriminatory provisions still in the Constitution. Just go and look it up, right? So this is not putting race back into the Constitution. This is including those who were previously excluded on the basis of race, on the basis that they were an inferior race. This is correcting that racially discriminatory exclusion by including them, recognising them, and it's including them by guaranteeing them a voice when Parliament makes changes to the Native Title Act or closing the gap policies, etc., that it needs to make about Indigenous Australians, which hopefully, if they're guaranteed a voice, that will also help prevent a repeat of some of those past discriminatory policies and help ensure better outcomes. So this is actually about unity. It's about inclusion and unity. And if we vote yes, we would be making a national commitment to dialogue, listening, partnership, mutual respect. That's what this is about. It's not about division.
Thanks, Shireen. So I promised 3 questions from the floor. Do we have? Thank you. We've got a microphone.
Thank you. It's not so much a question, but more sort of just observation from us as Aboriginal young people up here. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here, but I want to particularly thank Noel Pearson for being here. It's not every day that you get to sit in the same room as someone like Noel, let alone drink a boost juice with him down in the courtyard. You know, I recall in 2019 being a 15 going on 16-year-old Aboriginal kid working on his Aboriginal Studies major project and figuring out what I'm going to do. And I come across the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I'm like, sitting in my room, watching Noel speak about it's time for constitutional recognition, talking about the torment of our powerlessness, talking about voice, treaty, truth, and wondering why wasn't this supported by Malcolm Turnbull in 2017, which ironically now he supports. But so yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Noel for working so hard on this for so long. You know, we recognise this as Aboriginal young people, and we're going to be working towards it for you now. You know, we're on the ground, we're here for you as well. We recognise the work you've done, so thank you.
So who wants to follow that up the top there?
I'd just also like to make an observation. If this, I'm a big supporter of The Voice. I've got a radio show on Cool Radio. I've been supporting The Voice for the last 7 months. I'd like to have a chat with Noel afterwards, maybe. But if this is all about unity, then why are we still playing the race card? I only see one race living on this planet, and we're the human race. So I think we need to change the language to exclude race and just identify us as humans as well. So, that's my statement.
Thank you. Oh, over here.
Thank you, everyone. Like I suspect most people here, I will definitely be voting yes for The Voice. But what my question is about is, what do you think should be the next steps after that? So hopefully we will wake up the day after the referendum to a resounding yes vote. But for those 97% of us who are non-Indigenous, what do we need to do as the next step to ensure that the voice gets heard? And more than that, so for instance, some of the objections that have been raised to support things like treaty and extended land rights and that sort of thing, what do we need to keep doing? Because I feel like the work won't end with the referendum. What can we do to keep ensuring that that voice is powerful and to hopefully increase the power and sovereignty of Indigenous people, as Shireen was saying, that will hopefully shine through with The Voice, but how to make that more powerful?
Albanese has committed to the whole Uluru Statement.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, look, the first job is to get this through, right? And I love the optimism, but let's not be complacent. There is no room for complacency. And the first thing to point out is this will only get over the line if every single Australian who wants to see this succeed commits to not being a passive bystander. And as Noel said, do the door knocking, go out there, persuade everyone you know. Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, and the government has committed to the whole Uluru Statement. So he's committed to the referendum, obviously, but also to a Macquarie Commission. But it's important to know that there's no guarantee, right? So everything about the way The Voice operates in the future depends on goodwill. So political will. And certainly if we vote yes, then that is a huge expression of goodwill. And this will be an institution that carries the endorsement of the Australian people, and that will carry moral and political power. But in terms of treaties down the track, it's an aspiration that Indigenous people have had for a long, long, long time. But treaties are political agreements, and they depend on political will of the government. If there's no political will, then there won't be agreements and treaties in the future. That's just the political reality, right? Because it takes 2 or 3 to tango. In our federation, it takes 3, state, territory, federal government. So I would say if we succeed at this, that will be a huge first step in generating a cultural shift, as I said, a commitment to respect, partnership, dialogue that is will be conducive to better outcomes and good things in the future. But it will be all of our responsibility to keep that going and it'll be, Indigenous people will have a responsibility to hold The Voice accountable, to ensure The Voice is doing a good job. And we all Australians will have a responsibility to hold government and parliaments accountable. We want governments and parliaments to be doing the right thing by Indigenous people in the future. So ultimately it will be up to us as Australians to keep the goodwill going so that good things can be achieved.
There were naysayers leading up to 1901. There's a big no campaign. The numbers in New South Wales were very high in the no camp. The first referendum yielded very high numbers of the New South Wales colony that was against the Federation. So I was astounded to read all about the history of the those last 10 years. 3 referenda had to be held. First one, as I said, had New South Wales as the most doubtful state. And then Queensland and Western Australia abstained from the vote. And they had to have another one where Queensland was involved and Western Australia wasn't. And so the third referendum was just Western Australia itself, which finally acceded to the idea of the Federation. We've got to remind ourselves there's always no people. And the no people back in the 1890s were saying no to Australia. Thank God the yeses prevailed. Would have remained in the colonies. There would have been no federation if the no vote had succeeded in 1898, 99. That's a moment where we have now recreated an important moment about whether we're going to perfect the Constitution and whether sufficient numbers of Australians are going to lead the country to yes. Because we know at every referendum there will always be a weight of inertia that wants to stay where we are. And, and I kind of imagine, well, what did all those people who said no in 1898, what did they think in 10 years later? What did they think about the achievement of Australia that they had opposed? I kind of think that maybe they would have thought, oh, this Australia is not a bad idea. Sometimes it falls upon a generation to take the leadership, to lead their nation in adopting a crucial reform. And I think this referendum coming up is one of those moments where we need the yes people of Australia to say, let's do this, we have to do this, this is going to be a good thing, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of people have misgivings or have reasons to oppose it.
Just on Noel's point around, I guess, misgivings of the people who oppose, I love analogies. I'll put that out first and foremost. And for fear, again, of oversimplifying what is quite a complex space, you can be the biggest, juiciest peach in the shelves. Some people just don't like peaches, and that's okay. So don't try and appeal to the people that don't like the peaches, because quite frankly, you're wasting your time. They don't like peaches. They've made a decision. The peach is not for me. What we need to do, as we've heard time and time again, is the legwork now. I live in hope that we will have a successful referendum in the latter part of this year. But the reality of the situation, as Shireen has said, is not to be complacent with the work that we've got ahead of us. And so my plea, for want of a better term, is to show up to the train stations, the shopping malls, the universities, hand out the flyers, have the conversations, be diligent, focus energy in the right direction so that we're not, getting caught in the weeds of misinformation and downright lies. And so I think that this is a real opportunity, and we need to grab it with two hands.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And I know there was a couple more questions, but we've come to the end of our time. And so, Noel Pearson, it's been a privilege. A wholeheartedly thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge. 'Cause Gary Field, from someone who has spent most of their life on Duck and Young country, I'm so proud of you as a young, deadly man. And that's just carrying on a very long legacy. And I just think it's wonderful. And just, can we give him a... And Shireen, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your advocacy and your continued support of our people and our communities. Okay, I also want to thank the Radical Centre Reform Lab at Macquarie Law School for hosting this event with the generous support from foundation donors Henry and Marcia Pinksier, and in partnership with the Macquarie Business School and the Macquarie Minds and Intelligence Initiative. It's inspiring to see different faculties working together on this. I also want to thank Anne-Marie Gretsch, from the Office of the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Indigenous Strategy. I know that her and Shireen have been on the phone constantly, particularly today, but for the last couple of weeks. So thank you very much for all of, for those departments and also for the support of their teams. And to Marcus Ariza, Michael Rampy, and the videography team for filming and live streaming this event. Thank you also to Reconciliation New South Wales for the support that they've provided tonight. Can we just give everyone... This was a truly collaborative effort demonstrating how many different people and entities can join together to make good things happen. This is what this referendum is about. It is about all Australians working together to recognise Indigenous peoples by giving them a long overdue voice in their own affairs. We also, I'm going to promote that Macquarie University has also developed a micro-credential on the Indigenous voice to Parliament, which we have had nothing but overwhelming positive feedback about. So we have some brochures that when you're outside having some food and drink, yep, Anne-Marie's got one in hand there. We'll be handing them out, and we encourage you to do that micro-credential, but we also encourage you to pay it forward. And if you feel that it's really informative and that it's really valuable, someone asked one of the questions we didn't get to about those kitchen table discussions. Get the other people around the kitchen table to do the micro-credential and to be informed. Yeah, it's I must say that it's just a fantastic resource. And thank you for all those that have attended tonight, online and face-to-face. So now, for those that are here physically, please join us in some nibblies and make sure you take some of the information and materials, and also carry on the discussion out in the foyer. I'm sure that our panellists would be happy to continue that discussion. And so, again, thank you very much, and good night.